It started with something so small, it almost felt ridiculous. Like the kind of story you'd hear from someone else and shake your head in disbelief. That night, I had just realized I was out of my kids' favorite dessert. A simple pudding I'd made for them since they were little. The one thing that always brought them to the kitchen table with smiles instead of complaints. But when I told them there was none left, the house changed. The air went heavy. Nathan looked up from his phone, his eyes sharp and cold. While Emily sighed as if I'd personally failed the entire family. I stood there in my old apron, still holding the empty bowl, thinking how absurd it was that a missing dessert could carry so much weight. Yet deep down, I knew it wasn't really about the pudding. It was about something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Nathan pushed back his chair so hard it screeched against the floor. He said something under his breath. And even though I didn't quite catch the words, I could feel the resentment in his tone. Emily crossed her arms and muttered that I should gone shopping earlier if I'd really cared. My heart ached. Not from the words themselves, but from what they meant. There was no gratitude left. No warmth in their voices. Just a cold expectation that I existed to serve them. The kitchen, once filled with laughter and the smell of vanilla, felt like a stranger's house. I tried to brush it off, saying I'd make something else. Maybe warm apple slices, or a quick batch of cookies. But Nathan just rolled his eyes and walked away, leaving his unfinished plate on the table like I was the maid. Emily followed, her perfume lingering longer than her presence. I stayed there, staring at the empty pudding bowl as if it could give me answers. My hands trembled slightly when I set it down in the sink. I thought about all the times I'd rushed to make their favorites after work. The nights I'd stayed up folding their clothes. The mornings I'd packed lunches while they slept in. I used to believe that love, when poured endlessly into others, would circle back someday. But now, I wasn't so sure. I realized I'd built my whole identity around being their mother, their provider, their safety net. And maybe that was my mistake, loving them so fiercely that I forgot to leave some love for myself. When I finally turned off the kitchen light, the house was silent, but not peaceful. There was a kind of emptiness that clung to the walls. The kind that hums after an argument you didn't know I've been having for years. I walked to my room slowly, feeling every creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet. My reflection in the hallway mirror caught me off guard. Tired eyes, hair loosely pinned, a faint smear of flour still on my cheek. I looked like someone who'd been fading for a long time without realizing it. As I sat on the edge of my bed, a strange thought crossed my mind. Maybe the pudding wasn't the only thing that had run out. Maybe patience, tenderness, even respect, those had been draining too. One unspoken moment at a time. I didn't know it then. But that night marked the beginning of the end. It was the last evening I would still believe that love, no matter how unconditional, could keep a family together. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. As I always did. Habit is something that clings to you even when your heart no longer remembers why it started. The smell of coffee filled the air, but it didn't comfort me the way it used to. I watched the thin stream of steam rise from the cup and fade into nothing. The kitchen looked the same chipped tiles, same wooden table, but somehow it felt colder, like the soul of the house had left overnight. Nathan came downstairs first, dressed in his neat shirt and slacks, his face buried in his phone. He didn't say good morning. He didn't even look at me. He simply sat down and said in that distant tone of his that he'd have his usual breakfast, and to hurry up because he had a meeting. I did as he asked. Out of instinct, more than willingness. I scrambled his eggs, buttered his toast, poured his coffee, and placed the plate in front of him. For a moment, I thought about asking if he wanted dessert for later, but the words felt heavy, trapped in my throat. When Emily walked in, the room shifted again. She was always elegant, polished, the kind of woman who carried herself as if the world owed her a gentle breeze wherever she went. She greeted Nathan with a smile, then looked at me as if I were a shadow on the wall. Her tone was soft but sharp when she mentioned that the kitchen looked messy. I wanted to say that I'd been up since 5, that I'd already cleaned twice, that my hands ached from scrubbing. But instead, I just nodded, like a child scolded by her parents. It was strange how the balance of power had shifted in this house. Once, I was the center of their universe, the one who held everything together. Now, I was just an afterthought in the background of their perfect lives. I caught my reflection in the toaster's chrome surface, stooped shoulders, tired eyes. A woman who had forgotten how to take up space. After breakfast, Nathan left in a hurry, leaving his half-finished cup on the table. Emily stayed behind for a few minutes, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing at me as if debating whether to say something. When she finally spoke, her words were coated with false concern. She said she'd noticed how forgetful I'd become lately, how I'd been misplacing things, how maybe I needed help managing my finances. The implications stung more than the words themselves. I smiled faintly, pretending not to understand, and said I was fine. But inside, I could feel something breaking. When did caring for them turn into being controlled by them? When did love turn into suspicion? As she walked out the door, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. At least for the rest of the day, it'd have silence. I sat at the kitchen table long after they left, tracing the wood grain with my fingers. The morning light poured through the window, falling on the old photo frames that lined the counter. In one, Nathan was 6, holding his first soccer trophy, smiling so wide that his eyes nearly disappeared. In another, Emily in her prom dress, her father's arm around her shoulder, her face glowing with joy. They were moments frozen in time, proof that love had once lived here. I pressed my hand against the glass and whispered, maybe to them, maybe to myself, that I'd done my best. But my best had turned me invisible. Somewhere between their first steps and their first paychecks, I'd stopped being their mother and had become their servant. The coffee had gone cold by the time I stood up. Outside, the world kept moving, indifferent to the quiet collapse happening inside my kitchen. You could say it all began with that dessert, but I knew better. That pudding was just the first crack in the mask I'd worn for decades. I just hadn't realized yet that the mask was already crumbling beyond repair. Later that afternoon, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table again, surrounded by unpaid bills, grocery receipts, and a checkbook that no longer balanced. Numbers blurred together like meaningless symbols. My pension was supposed to last me comfortably, but somehow the account had been shrinking month after month. I had always trusted Nathan to handle the online banking. I had told me it was safer that way, that I could rest easy, knowing he was taking care of things. Back then, I believed him. Now, I wasn't sure I believed anything anymore. I tried logging into the account myself, fumbling with passwords I hadn't used in years. Each failed attempt left me more anxious, more aware of how out of touch I'd become with my own life. The screen finally flashed, access denied, and I sat there staring at it, feeling small. How had I gone from managing an entire household to being locked out of my own finances? A soft knock pulled me out of my thoughts. It was Linda, my neighbor from next door. She was around my age. Widowed too. Always showing up with a gentle smile and a casserole dish she claimed was just extra dinner. She had a kindness about her that reminded me of the world before everything turned so complicated. That afternoon, she carried no dish. Only concern. She asked if everything was all right because she'd heard voices raised the previous night. I forced a laugh. Told her it was nothing. Just the kids getting emotional over silly things. But Linda didn't buy it. Her eyes lingered on my face, on the faint swelling near my cheekbone that I hadn't managed to cover completely. She didn't press the issue. But she sat down across from me. Her tone, calm yet firm. She said sometimes the people we love the most can hurt us the deepest, and that pretending everything is fine only digs the wound further. I wanted to argue. To defend my children. To say they were just stressed or tired. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I told her about the missing money. The strange withdrawals I couldn't explain. Linda listened quietly, nodding slowly. Then asked if I had checked the property papers for the house recently. I frowned, not understanding why she'd ask such a thing. She leaned forward, lowering her voice, and said that she'd seen similar situations before, families where children, out of greed or desperation, had manipulated aging parents into signing away their homes. The suggestion hit me like a slap. My instinct was to deny it immediately. To insist my kids would never do such a thing. But the tremor in my hands betrayed the fear rising inside me. After she left, I went to the drawer in the hallway where I kept important documents. I hadn't opened it in years. The folder smelled faintly of dust and paper gone stale. My name was still printed neatly on the house deed, but next to it, in newer ink, was Nathan's. I don't remember ever adding him. For a long moment, I just stood there staring at that piece of paper, my mind spinning between disbelief and dread. I tried to recall the last time Nathan had asked me to sign anything. It must have been months ago. Some papers had said were related to a bank form for his business loan. I hadn't thought twice about it. Of course, I'd signed. He was my son. That was what trust looked like, or at least what I thought it was. My chest felt tight, and I had to sit down before my knees gave out. All at once, the house around me began to feel foreign, like it no longer belonged to me. Maybe it never had. Not really. Not since the day I handed my power over, under the illusion of love. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound left in the room, steady and indifferent. Like a reminder that life goes on, even when your world stops. I pressed my palm against the deed, the ink cool beneath my fingertips, and whispered a truth I didn't want to face. The people I loved most might have already turned my home into their possession long before I noticed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house felt louder than usual, the ticking of the clock, the faint groan of the old floorboards, even the wind outside brushing against the windows. My thoughts kept circling back to that paper, the one that had my son's name printed right beside mine. I stared at the ceiling, the shadows shifting with the headlights passing outside, and wondered when exactly my life had slipped out of my hands. I used to think losing control was something that happened suddenly, like a storm tearing through in one violent moment. But lying there, I realized it was quieter than that. It happened through small moments, a signature here, a concession there, 1,000 times saying yes when I should said no. I had built my whole world around my children. And now that world was closing in on me. Around 3 a.m, I got up and walked to the living room. The air was cold, sharp enough to sting my skin. On the mantel sat a framed photo of my husband, taken the summer before he passed. His eyes still looked at me the same way. Steady. Protective. I whispered to him. Half ashamed. Half desperate. Asking what I should do. The silence that followed was the loneliest answer I'd ever received. By breakfast, Nathan was already downstairs, pouring himself coffee as if nothing had happened. I studied him quietly, trying to see the boy he once was, boy who used to leave sticky fingerprints on the refrigerator door and hug me just because. But all I could see was the man he had become: polished, impatient, his kindness reserved for outsiders. He noticed me watching and frowned. He asked why I looked so tired. I told him I couldn't sleep. To that I'd been thinking about some documents I'd found. His face changed instantly. He straightened, setting down his mug with a little too much force. He said I shouldn't be snooping around things I didn't understand. That it was just bank paperwork, and that it'd only confuse myself. The way he spoke to me, sharp, condescending, felt like a knife dressed as a warning. I wanted to ask if he remembered whose name used to be the only one on that deed. But fear stopped me. I just nodded and watched as he left for work. His briefcase swinging. His tie perfect. His smile gone the second he stepped outside. Emily came by later that afternoon. Her visit unannounced. As usual. She brought a box of macarons from some fancy bakery and set them on the table like a peace offering. She asked how I was doing. Her voice sweet but empty. I told her I was fine, though the word tasted bitter in my mouth. When I mentioned I'd been looking over some old papers, she shifted uncomfortably. She said Nathan had things under control. That I shouldn't stress myself with complicated matters. I tried to read her face, to see if she knew about the deed. But she avoided my eyes, scrolling on her phone, pretending to check messages. I realized then that the silence between them wasn't ignorance, it was complicity. They both knew. My own children had turned my trust into a strategy. I smiled politely, the kind of smile that hides a storm, and asked if they wanted coffee. Inside, I was shaking so hard, I could barely steady the kettle. When Emily left, the house felt colder than before. I sat in the living room wrapped in an old blanket, the kind my husband and I used to share on winter nights. His voice came back to me, not as sound but as memory. He used to tell me I had to be careful with how much I gave away. That love, when stretched too far, becomes permission. I never wanted to believe him. I thought love was meant to be endless, unconditional. But now I could see what had meant. I'd mistaken devotion for weakness. And they had learned to use that against me. Tears burned my eyes. But I refused to let them fall. Instead, I whispered to the quiet room that I was done being scared. My hands trembled as I picked up the folder with the house papers and pressed it to my chest. It felt like holding my own heart, worn, bruised, but still beating. That night, for the first time in years, I locked my bedroom door before I went to sleep. It was a small act, but it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd long forgotten. The next morning began with the sound of rain tapping softly against the kitchen window. I stood there for a while, watching it slide down the glass like threads of silver. The house was quiet. Almost too quiet. The kind of silence that comes after you've cried the night before. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the table, staring at the folder that still lay there. The edges were slightly bent from being clutched too tightly. I opened it again, my eyes tracing the signatures, the printed lines, the bank stamps that all looked official and final. My name was there. Yes, but so was Nathan's. Clear and bold. I hadn't imagined it. I didn't know whether to feel anger or shame. Maybe both. As I sat there, the sound of footsteps approached. It was Linda, holding an umbrella, her hair slightly damp from the rain. She gave me that soft smile of hers, the kind that feels like sunlight in a dark room. She asked if she could come in, and I just nodded. Linda sat across from me and listened while I told her everything. My words came out shaky, but once they started, I couldn't stop. I told her about the bank account, the missing money, the way Nathan spoke to me, the way Emily pretended not to notice. When I showed her the papers, her expression tightened. She said gently that it looked like more than just a misunderstanding. She told me she had a friend who used to work at the courthouse and that we could find out exactly what those documents were. The thought both terrified and relieved me. For the first time, someone else knew. Someone was on my side. Linda said she'd go with me the next day to get them checked. But she warned me to be careful to not confront Nathan until we knew everything. I promised I wouldn't, though deep down I wasn't sure I could keep that promise. The idea of sleeping under the same roof with someone who might have stolen from me made my stomach twist. That evening, when Nathan came home, I tried to act normal. I served dinner, listened to him talk about his day, nodded at all the right moments. But it was getting harder to keep up the act. Every word out of his mouth sounded calculated, rehearsed. I noticed things I hadn't before, the way his tone changed when he spoke to me versus how he spoke to his friends on the phone. The way he made decisions for me without asking. He even reminded me that the property tax bill was due and said he'd already taken care of it. He smiled when he said it. That same smile I used to find comforting. But now it looked more like a mask. My appetite was gone. I excused myself, saying I was tired, and went to my room. Behind the closed door, I pressed my ear against the wood and listened to him pacing in the living room, talking quietly on his phone. I couldn't make out the words, but I heard one phrase, "Clearly she won't be a problem." My heart pounded so loudly, I thought he might hear it through the door. The next day, Linda picked me up early. The courthouse smelled like paper and old carpet, a place where lives were reduced to ink and signatures. Her friend, a woman with glasses and kind eyes, looked over the documents carefully. After a few minutes, she sighed and said that the papers were, in fact, a partial property transfer. It hadn't gone through completely because a final form was missing. But Nathan had already initiated the process. If that last paper was filed, I would lose half ownership of my house, my home. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Linda put a hand on my arm to steady me. She said we still had time, that nothing was final yet. But her voice sounded distant. All I could think about was how many times I'd signed something without reading. How many times I'd trusted him simply because he was my son. As we walked out into the drizzle, I looked up at the gray sky and whispered to myself that I wouldn't be silent anymore. Love shouldn't cost your home, your peace, or your dignity. That day, I decided to fight back, even if I didn't yet know how. When I got home that afternoon, the rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low, heavy and gray, like they were waiting for something else to fall. The house smelled faintly of coffee and aftershave, Nathan's usual trail. I hung my coat by the door, trying to act natural, even though my mind was a whirlwind. I could still hear Linda's voice echoing in my head, calm but urgent, telling me to keep quiet until we had proof. But my heart was louder than reason. I walked into the kitchen, and there he was, sitting at the table, typing on his laptop as if he owned the place. Maybe in his mind, he already did. When he looked up, He smiled faintly and asked why I'd been out so long. I said I'd gone shopping, though I hadn't bought anything. He nodded without much interest, then went back to his screen. I stood there a moment too long, just watching him, seeing him not as my son but as a stranger wearing his face. Every sound in the room, the clicking of the keys, the hum of the refrigerator felt amplified. I wanted to shout, to ask him why, to make him tell me what he'd done. But I couldn't. I was afraid of his answer. That night, I took out the box of old letters my husband had written me years ago. I hadn't opened it since his funeral. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. The ink slightly faded, but his handwriting still strong. One letter caught my eye. It was from the year before he passed. He had written about his worries for the kids, about how he feared I was giving them too much, that I was teaching them dependence instead of gratitude. He said he trusted me to see the difference one day, even if it came too late. Reading those words felt like a whisper from the grave. Maybe he had seen this coming long before I did. I sat there until the clock struck midnight, the letter trembling in my hands. My husband had always believed I was strong enough to protect our family. I wondered what he would think if he saw me now, too afraid to confront my own child. The following morning, Emily called. Her voice was bright, overly cheerful, the kind of tone people use when they're about to ask for something. She said she wanted to come over for lunch, that Nathan had told her I'd been acting off lately. I could hear the undertone of concern that wasn't really concern at all. It was control disguised as care. I told her she could come, if nothing else. I needed to see her face to understand just how deep this went. When she arrived, she hugged me quickly, her perfume filling the room like a wall between us. She complimented the house, the furniture, even the curtains. It was strange, almost rehearsed. Then, over coffee, she said that Nathan had mentioned maybe it was time for me to start thinking about retirement homes. Just for safety, she said. The words hit like a slap. She smiled while saying them, sipping her coffee as if she hadn't just suggested sending me away. I asked her softly whose idea that was. Hers or his? She avoided my eyes and said nothing. After she left, I walked into my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. The afternoon light filtered through the blinds in thin stripes across the solnery floor. I could feel the walls closing in. It was no longer about a missing dessert or even the money. It was about control, slow, quiet control that had taken root years ago and was now tightening around my throat. For so long, I had believed that sacrifice was the highest form of love. I had given everything: time, comfort, independence, believing it would buy me closeness, respect, affection. But all it had done was teach them that I was theirs to manage. I looked down at my hands, at the faint wrinkles and the small scars from decades of work. They had built everything my children now enjoyed. Yet they were treated like something disposable. That was the moment I knew something had to change. Love without respect was no longer love. And if I didn't stand up for myself now, there'd be nothing left to stand on. The next day, the air in the house felt thick, like it was holding its breath. I woke up earlier than usual, my heart pounding before my feet even touched the floor. I knew something was coming, I could feel it. By the time the sun began to rise, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I peeked through the curtain and saw Emily stepping out, dressed in her usual elegance, a pale blue coat wrapped tight around her waist. Nathan followed a moment later, his expression unreadable. A man who had already decided what the day would bring. I didn't know what to expect, but the sight of the two of them together sent a cold wave through me. They never came as a pair unless there was something they wanted. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to be busy with the kettle. The door opened, and I heard their voices light, polite, almost cheerful. But the cheer didn't reach their eyes when they walked in. Nathan started the conversation casually, asking if I'd been feeling all right lately. Emily nodded along, echoing his words, saying they were both worried about me. It was the same tone doctors use before delivering bad news. I said I was fine, that I didn't need worrying. Nathan exchanged a glance with Emily, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin stack of papers. He said it was a formality, something to help him manage the bills and the property more efficiently. He told me it was for my benefit, that the house would stay protected that way. My stomach twisted as I watched him slide the papers across the table, his pen placed neatly on top. Emily smiled and told me it would just take a minute. I didn't reach for the pen. The sound of the ticking clock filled the silence between us. For the first time, I didn't nod, didn't obey. I looked at them both and asked if this had anything to do with the deed I'd already signed. The change in their faces was instant. Nathan's jaw tightened. Emily's smile faltered. They hadn't expected me to know. Nathan's voice hardened. He said, I must be confused. That Linda had probably been putting ideas in my head. My hands were trembling, but I refused to show it. I told him calmly that I'd already spoken to someone at the courthouse, that I knew what he was trying to do. The air in the room shifted, then thick, sharp, like before a thunderstorm. Nathan's charm disappeared, replaced by something darker. He accused me of not trusting him, of letting outsiders turn me against my own family. Emily tried to calm him down, but her voice wavered. I could see guilt flicker across her face like a shadow she couldn't hide. Before either of them could say more, there was a knock on the door. Linda's voice came from the other side, steady and clear, asking if everything was all right. I saw Nathan's eyes narrow. I opened the door without hesitation. Linda stepped in, holding her umbrella like a shield. She greeted them politely, her calm composure throwing Nathan off balance. Then she turned to me and said in a tone that left no room for misunderstanding, that I should be careful what I sign, because once I did, I could lose everything. Nathan exploded. He told her to stay out of family business, that she had no idea what she was talking about. Linda didn't flinch. She told him that the documents were a property transfer and that had already filed part of it months ago. The color drained from his face. Emily froze. The silence that followed was heavy and long. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator behind us, the sound oddly loud in the stillness. Nathan tried to laugh it off, said she was mistaken, but his voice cracked. I looked at Linda, then at my children, and in that moment, something inside me shifted. The fear that had kept me quiet for years began to burn into something stronger, anger. Yes, but also clarity. I realized they weren't doing this because they needed my help. They were doing it because they thought they could, because I had taught them they could. I picked up the papers slowly, held them in my hands, and then tore them clean down the middle. Nathan stared at me like I'd struck him. Emily gasped. I stood taller than I had in years, and said, steady and quiet, that this house was mine, and I wasn't giving away another piece of it or myself ever again. That night, the storm finally broke. Not outside the sky was clear, but inside my house, the one I had built with every ounce of love and labor, I had. Nathan paced back and forth across the living room like a caged animal, his footsteps striking the floor in angry rhythm. Emily sat on the couch, arms crossed. Her perfect composure cracking with every word he shouted. I stood near the doorway, trying to steady my breath. My hands were trembling. But not from fear anymore. This time, it was from the rush of finally standing my ground. Nathan accused me of being manipulated, of letting a nosy neighbor destroy our family. He said I had humiliated him, that people would talk, that I had no idea what kind of damage I'd done. I wanted to laugh. For years, I'd been the one humiliated in silence, walking on eggshells under my own roof. But instead of laughing, I spoke quietly. I told him the only thing I had destroyed was the illusion that I would stay quiet forever. Emily tried to intervene, saying this had gone too far, that we needed to calm down. But her voice wavered when she turned to me. She said she only wanted what was best for me, that they had done this because they cared, because they didn't want to see me make mistakes. I asked her what kind of mistake: living too long, loving them too much, giving them everything I had until there was nothing left. My words made her flinch. For a second, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who used to draw me cards with hearts and glitter glue. But the moment passed. She looked away. Nathan stopped pacing and stared at me, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. He told me that if I didn't trust him, maybe it was time for me to find somewhere else to live, that the house was becoming too much for me anyway. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat dressed as concern. I felt my chest tighten. But I refused to give him the reaction he wanted. Instead, I nodded slowly and said that maybe he was right, maybe the house was too big. But if anyone was leaving, it wouldn't be me. The words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. Nathan laughed, low and bitter. He said I was being dramatic, that no one would believe my version of things. Emily stayed quiet, her eyes darting between us. I walked past him, calm and steady, and opened the front door. The cool night air swept in, carrying the faint scent of rain and cut grass. I pointed toward the driveway and told them both that if they wanted to leave, they should do it now. Emily started to speak, but her voice cracked. Nathan's face twisted with disbelief. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a cold whisper, asking if I really wanted to do this. I looked him straight in the eye and said yes. My voice didn't shake this time. Years of fear, guilt, and exhaustion fell away with that one word. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just stood there, waiting. After a long pause, Emily grabbed her purse and walked out first. Nathan followed, muttering something I couldn't hear. The sound of the door closing behind them was louder than any storm I'd ever known. When the silence returned, it wasn't the heavy kind that used to suffocate me. It was lighter, almost fragile. The house felt empty but finally safe. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, half expecting them to come back, half hoping they wouldn't. My knees gave out, and I sank to the floor, the cold tiles pressing against my palms. Tears came, then hot, shaking, uncontrollable. Not just from pain, but from release. For the first time in years, I cried for myself. I cried for the woman who had loved too much, who had worked herself raw for the sake of others, who had lost her voice somewhere between motherhood and survival. When the tears finally stopped, I wiped my face and looked around. The furniture, the pictures, the walls, all of it felt different now. This was no longer a house built for others to take from. It was mine again. My home. My peace. My proof that I could still stand. I whispered into the quiet room, almost like a prayer. No more. The next morning, the house was still, the kind of stillness that follows a storm. When everything has been broken open and yet, somehow, feels cleaner for it. I made myself coffee and sat by the window, watching the sunlight crawl slowly across the floorboards. It felt strange being alone again, though not in the same way as before. This time, the silence didn't scare me. It almost felt like freedom. The mug was warm in my hands, grounding me in a reality that was finally my own. But every now and then, a thought slipped in. Where were they? Were they angry? Ashamed? Planning something else? I pushed the questions away, telling myself it didn't matter. For once, I wanted to exist without being needed, blamed, or controlled. The coffee tasted a little bitter, but it was the first cup I'd had in years that was completely mine. By afternoon, I began noticing small things, details I had stopped seeing after years of exhaustion. The faded curtains, the chipped paint near the doorway, the half-dead plant by the sink. Each flaw felt like a confession from the house itself, telling me how long it had been neglected while I'd been too busy keeping peace with everyone else. I spent hours cleaning, rearranging, fixing what I could. With every small act, I felt something inside me straighten out. By evening, the house smelled of lemon soap and fresh air. I played the old jazz record my husband used to love, the one I hadn't dared to touch since he died. The music filled the rooms like sunlight spilling through old glass. I smiled for the first time in days, maybe weeks. It was a small, quiet smile, but it felt real. When the record ended, I sat down on the couch and let my head rest back. My body ached, but my heart didn't. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't heavy. That night, though, the dreams came. Not nightmares exactly, but memories twisted into something half real. I saw Nathan as a little boy, running through the yard, his laughter echoing across the summer air. Emily followed close behind, her curls bouncing, both of them calling out for me. In the dream, I was younger, too stronger, full of life, holding a bowl of pudding in my hands, their favorite dessert. When I tried to hand it to them, they turned away, their faces older now, cold, distant. I reached out, but my arms felt heavy, my voice barely a whisper. Then I woke up, breathless, my pillow damp with tears I didn't remember shedding. The clock read 3:07 a.m. I lay there in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator down the hall. That small, steady sound reminding me that life kept moving, whether I was ready or not. I whispered into the darkness that I forgave them, not because they deserved it, but because I couldn't carry the bitterness anymore. Forgiveness wasn't a gift to them. It was the key to freeing myself. The next morning, I went for a walk for the first time in months. The air was cool, the trees beginning to change color, the world soft and golden in the early light. As I walked past Linda's house, she stepped out onto her porch and waved. I smiled and walked over. I'm grateful just to see a familiar face. She asked if I was all right, and I told her, simply, that I was better. She nodded, as if she already knew. We stood there for a while, watching the leaves flutter down the street, and I realized how long it had been since I'd allowed myself to stand still without guilt. When I got back home, I opened every window in the house. The breeze swept through, carrying away the last remnants of tension that had clung to the walls. The curtains lifted like sails. And for the first time, the air smelled of peace. I whispered to myself that solitude wasn't punishment, it was healing. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew I wasn't afraid of it anymore. That night, as the house settled into its quiet rhythm, I sat on the couch with a box of old photographs on my lap. The edges of the prints were frayed, corners curled from years of being handled, stored, and forgotten. I began sorting through them one by one: birthdays, graduations, beach trips, the messy, happy chaos that used to define our lives. In one picture, Nathan was sitting on his father's shoulders, his small hands gripping a straw hat too big for his head. In another, Emily was twirling in a dress I had sewn by hand, her laughter caught mid-motion. Alive, even on paper. I traced my fingers over their faces, wondering how those children, those innocent, loving little souls, had grown into strangers who could look at me with such coldness. Maybe I had spoiled them. Maybe I had taught them to expect everything without ever teaching them the weight of sacrifice. It was a painful thought, but also an honest one. Parenting doesn't end when your children grow up, it just changes shape. Sometimes it becomes the hardest lesson of all: learning to let go. As I set the photos aside, I thought about my own childhood. My parents had little money, but what they lacked in wealth, they made up for in respect and boundaries. My mother was strict, but she never let anyone make her small. My father used to say that dignity was the one inheritance that couldn't be stolen unless you gave it away. Somehow, in trying to give my kids everything I never had, I'd forgotten that truth. I wanted their lives to be easy, so I absorbed all the struggle myself. I thought that was love. But love without boundaries is just slow self-destruction. And I had been living proof of that. Sitting there, in the dim light, I whispered a promise to the woman. I used to be the one who believed she was only valuable when she was needed. I promised her that the rest of her life would be different. No more living in fear of being alone. No more giving everything away just to keep people close. Later that evening, I found myself wandering into the kitchen. The same kitchen where everything had fallen apart, where one missing dessert had cracked open a lifetime of denial. I stood there for a long moment, my hand resting on the counter where Nathan had once slammed his fist, where Emily had rolled her eyes, where I had stood silent, pretending it didn't hurt. The air was still, but it didn't carry the same tension anymore. It felt neutral, waiting for something new. I opened the cupboard and took out a small mixing bowl. My body moved on instinct: flour, milk, sugar, vanilla. The same simple ingredients I had memorized decades ago. As the pudding simmered on the stove, the smell began to fill the room. It wasn't for anyone else this time. It was for me. I poured it into a small dish and sat at the table while it cooled, the warmth of the bowl seeping into my palms. When I finally tasted it, it was soft, sweet, familiar. But it didn't taste like guilt anymore. It tasted like closure. When I went to bed that night, I didn't cry. I didn't even replay the arguments or the betrayals. I just felt still. For years, I had believed peace meant having everyone around me happy. Now, I understood, it meant being able to breathe without permission. Before turning off the light, I glanced at the empty hallway, the photos lining the walls, the quiet proof of a life that had not been wasted, just misunderstood. I whispered into the dark that I forgave my children, but I wouldn't lose myself for them again. Somewhere deep inside, I felt my husband's presence. In the quiet reassurance that I was doing what had hoped I would someday do: stand up for myself. and for the first time in years, when I closed my eyes, sleep came easily. It came like a soft tide washing over the wreckage of everything that had been broken. The next morning brought a strange kind of calm, the kind that feels like the world has finally stopped spinning after years of imbalance. I made breakfast slowly, not out of obligation, but out of choice. The eggs sizzled quietly in the pan, and I realized I hadn't cooked just for myself in decades. There was no rush. No one barking orders or checking the clock. I ate by the Brownings window, watching the neighborhood come alive, the mail truck, kids on bikes, Linda watering her flowers. For a moment, I wondered if this was what freedom looked like. Not grand or dramatic. Just simple. Quiet. Mine. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed. The screen showed a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated before answering, my chest tightening with old reflexes. It was a man's voice. Polite but uncertain. He introduced himself as a lawyer from Nathan's office. My heart sank. He said there were some issues with financial records and that Nathan might need my statement to clear up confusion. The words sounded rehearsed. I told him calmly that I'd already spoken with my own lawyer and that any questions should go through them. There was a pause. Then the man said softly that I'd probably done the right thing. That was the moment I knew something had gone wrong for Nathan and that life was finally starting to balance itself. Later that day, I met Linda for coffee. She listened while I told her about the call. Her face thoughtful, but not surprised. She said, "People like Nathan always thought they were untouchable until consequences finally found them." I stirred my coffee slowly, the spoon clinking against the cup. I didn't feel triumphant, just tired. I told her I didn't want revenge. I just wanted peace. Linda smiled and said peace was the sweetest kind of justice. We talked for hours about life, about aging, about how easy it is to lose yourself when your whole identity is built around other people. She told me she was thinking of selling her house and starting a small bakery in town. Something cozy. Something that smelled of cinnamon and new beginnings. She said I should join her. I laughed, but the idea stayed in my mind long after I got home. Baking had always been my language of love. Maybe it could become my language of freedom too. That evening, I received another call, this time from Emily. Her voice was soft, hesitant, different from the last time we spoke. She said she'd heard about Nathan's trouble, that things at his company were unraveling fast. I could hear fear under her words. The kind that comes when the illusion of stability finally breaks. She said she missed me, that she wanted to come by and talk. I told her she could. I spent the next hour tidying the house even though it was already spotless. When she arrived, she stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, her eyes scanning the familiar rooms as if they were foreign. Now, she looked smaller somehow. Not in size, but in spirit. We sat at the table where so many fights had happened. The silence stretched until she finally whispered that she was sorry. Sorry for not seeing what was happening. For letting her brother control everything. For treating me like I was someone who needed managing instead of love. The apology trembled, but it was real. I reached across the table and took her hand. I didn't say I forgave her. Not yet. But I held her hand anyway. Sometimes silence can say everything, words can't. When she left, the sky was turning pink. I stood at the door watching her walk down the path. On the same path she used to run along as a child when she was late for dinner. The years between then and now felt like a lifetime I could finally breathe through. The air was cool. And for the first time, I didn't feel small, standing in my own doorway. I felt steady. capable, a whole. I knew Nathan's story wasn't over, there would be fallout. Apologies, maybe. Or maybe just distance, but that no longer terrified me. Life didn't need to be perfect to be peaceful. As I locked the door, I caught a glimpse of myself in the glass, older, softer, but still here, still standing. And that was enough. The days that followed passed in a rhythm that felt almost foreign at first. Mornings were quiet. Afternoons, steady. Nights peaceful. The anxiety that used to live in my chest had turned into something lighter space. Maybe. Or just the absence of fear. I started baking again. Not out of habit, but out of joy. The kitchen, once a battlefield of control and resentment, became warm again. The smell of butter and sugar filled the air like forgiveness itself. One morning, Linda came over with a stack of brochures for available shops in town. She'd found one, a small corner space with big windows and an old brick facade. She said it was perfect for the bakery idea we'd talked about. At first, I laughed it off. But then she said something that lingered. She told me starting over isn't about forgetting the past. It's about finally choosing what comes next. That night, I looked at my husband's photo and said quietly that I was ready. A month later, the bakery opened. We called it Sweet Grace. A name Linda chose because she said grace was what had carried both of us through. The first morning, Adidilado quastered. The sunlight poured through the front window, turning the flour dust in the air into tiny sparks. I wore a clean white apron and baked the first batch of tenin, desserts myself. Cakes, pies, cookies, and, of course, pudding. The scent drew in the first customers before we even opened the door. Some were neighbors. Others just passers-by who followed the smell. Linda handled the counter with her easy charm, chatting with everyone, while I stayed near the ovens, listening to the quiet hum of new beginnings. It felt surreal after years of walking on eggshells in my own house. Here I was building something with my own two hands again. Every time someone smiled after taking a bite, it felt like reclaiming a piece of the life I thought I'd lost. A few weeks into running the bakery, I looked up one afternoon and froze. Standing by the window, just outside the glass, was Emily. She looked hesitant, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes searching for mine. I nodded for her to come in. She walked slowly, her gaze moving across the trays of pastries, the smell of cinnamon and vanilla surrounding us like a memory. She said she'd been coming by for a few days, just watching, afraid I wouldn't want to see her. I told her there was always a place for her here if she came with respect. Her eyes welled up. She bought 2 puddings, one for herself, one for Nathan. She said, I didn't ask where he was, or what had become of him. Maybe I didn't need to know. People find their lessons in their own time. She left quietly. And as I watched her go, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. The love I had for my children had changed shape. It wasn't blind or desperate now. It was steady, boundaried, and calm. That was enough. That evening, as the last customer left and the light turned golden across the counter, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the front window. The sign outside glowed faintly under the street lamp, Sweet Grace letters painted by my own hand. Linda was sweeping near the door, humming softly. I thought of how far I'd come from the woman who cried over an empty pudding bowl to someone who could build a life out of the same sweetness that once symbolized pain. Sometimes healing doesn't look like revenge or victory. Sometimes it looks like peace at the end of a long road. I smiled to myself, the smell of baked sugar still thick in the air. and whispered that I had finally found my way back home, even if home wasn't the same house anymore. The bakery had been open for nearly 6 months, when I realized just how much my life had changed. Mornings began early, before the sun rose, with the quiet comfort of dough being kneaded, ovens warming, and the smell of butter seeping into the walls. I had found a rhythm again. But this time it belonged only to me. Customers came and went, families, students, older couples, and I learned their names, their favorite treats, their small daily stories. The bakery wasn't just a place for sweets. It had become a space for peace, for connection, for second chances. Every now and then, I caught myself humming while I worked, something I hadn't done since my husband was alive. The air felt softer, the world slower, and my heart lighter. I no longer woke up thinking about what I'd lost. I woke up thinking about what I'd built. One afternoon, just as I was wiping down the counter, the bell over the door chimed. When I looked up, my breath caught. Nathan stood there. He looked different, thinner, older, his once confident posture replaced by a quiet hesitance. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Linda, who was near the register, gave me a gentle nod and disappeared into the back room. Nathan finally stepped forward, his voice low and unsteady. He said he'd heard about the bakery from Emily and that Shed told him I was doing well. He said he wanted to see for himself. I could tell he wasn't there for money or forgiveness. Not in the way he once would have been. He just looked tired. Defeated. He told me he was trying to make things right. That he was in therapy. That he was learning how to rebuild what had broken. I listened, my hands resting on the counter, my heart steady. I told him that I was glad he was getting help, and that life had a way of giving us exactly what we needed, just not always the way we wanted. He nodded, his eyes filling with quiet regret. Before leaving, he bought a single serving of pudding. He didn't say anything about it, but I understood. Some things didn't need words. When the door closed behind him, I stood there for a long time, letting the silence settle. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger or pity. What I felt was something deeper: acceptance. People change only when they're ready. And I'd learned not to wait for that readiness to save myself. Emily visited often after that day. She helped sometimes at the bakery on weekends. Her laughter soft but real again. We never spoke much about the past. It hung between us like a scar that had healed, but would always be visible. And that was all right. We were learning how to love each other again without pretending it had never hurt. On the anniversary of the bakery's opening, Linda and I decided to host a small celebration. The place was full of warmth and chatter. The smell of cinnamon sugar and coffee wrapping everyone like an embrace. Toward the end of the evening, as the guests began to leave, I stood by the window, watching the golden streetlights flicker against the glass. My reflection looked back at me, older. Yes, but stronger. Steadier. Softer. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, sitting in a silent kitchen, holding an empty bowl of pudding and wondering how love could turn so cruel. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her she would survive. That the emptiness she felt would one day make room for something beautiful. Life hadn't given me the ending. I once imagined it had given me something better. Myself. As I locked up that night, I turned to look one last time at the bakery. The tables gleaming. The air still carrying the faint sweetness of sugar and vanilla. I whispered a quiet goodbye to the woman I used to be, and a thank you to the one I'd become. Outside, the night was calm. The air cool and full of possibility. I walked home under the soft streetlights. My steps slow but sure. The world wasn't perfect. But neither was I, and that, finally, was enough. Love, I had learned, wasn't about giving everything away. It was about knowing when to keep something for yourself. And as the door of my home closed behind me, I smiled. The dessert hadn't been what ran out that night. Long ago it was my patience, my silence, my willingness to be less than whole. But now, my heart was full again. Sweet, steady, and finally mine.